For this exercise, I'm going to cover a variety of painting techniques for acrylic paint. The materials that I have here, black and white paint, water, brush, towels, some sort of acrylic flow enhancer, and some tape to tape off the sections. One of the first challenges that I'm going to have when I start painting is just figuring out how to mix it. And an important rule to remember that will make your life a lot easier, save you a ton of headaches, is to always add the dark to the light. This makes mixing much easier to control. Now you can see all I need is just a pinhead of black to change the value of the white. I add that and it's a small amount, but it's enough to make a noticeable difference from one value to the next. And then I'm just going to continue that process and I'm going to create a value scale and gradually increase the darkness by just gradually increasing the amount of black that I'm taking. And my goal here is to get a value scale of as many swatches as I can, or as many as I can fit. And if you do this correctly, you should be able to keep your palette fairly clean. And that's going to be really helpful moving forward. For these next exercises, I'm going to need some acrylic flow retarder or enhancer or extender or whatever. They're all pretty similar. They're just some medium that is designed to increase the drying time of the paint and make it a little bit easier to work with. So you'll see I put it in that cup first and then I put it on my palette to try to not contaminate it. So the first gradient that I'm doing here is a wet on wet smooth gradient. Now I have already mixed that flow extender into the black paint, and so I lay this down and then I'll lay down the white, and then the hope is that I can go back and forth over this transition area and the extender will allow me to kind of smoothly blend these values together. And as you can see, it improves the flow quite a bit. Now, one thing I want to be mindful of as I'm doing this is to be sure that the paint on the end of my brush isn't affecting the value too much. That it's not too light or dark. That I'm not bringing dark into the light or light into the dark when I don't necessarily want to. Now another gradient that I'm going to do here, another wet on wet gradient, is a choppy gradient. You could think of it as a little looser or a little bit more painterly. It's still a gradient, I'm just not trying to get that smooth finish that I just did. As my brush marks go back and forth across the transitional areas, they'll carry paint with them, and I'm just going to continue to do that with the goal of getting a gradual transition from dark to light. Only for this exercise, I'm not concerned with hiding my brush strokes. All right, this next one is a fun one, some palette knife texture. Got to give a shout out to Bob Ross for this one here. I'm going to start by doing a silhouette of some mountains using just a flat black, not using any more of the flow extender. I want this to dry pretty quickly and I'll go over to my dry brush gradient. Again, I'm no longer using any extender. I want this to dry pretty quickly. I start with a flat strip of black and then I'll just ease up on the pressure as I pull the brush downwards and let some of the paper start to show through. Now I'll let that dry and jump back over to the palette knife now. So on my tray, I'm going to pull out a little patch of white. I'm going to take my palette knife and run it through diagonally with the goal of getting a little roll of paint on the edge. Now I lay it on the paper, just set it very gently and just kind of slide it across the surface, letting it skid and catch the paint. It's a pretty tricky technique. It's going to take some practice for sure. I'm definitely not the master of it. If you're looking for the master of it, jump on over to a Bob Ross video and he'll show you how it's done. But here's the gist of it. So I've kind of decided where's my light, where's my dark. The light's coming from the left here, so I'm using white. I'll grab some gray paint and do the shadow side here now. And it's really easy to muddy this up. So you have to be okay with imperfection when you're doing this. Because if you go back and forth across this too many times, it's gonna start to smear and you're gonna lose a lot of that black. And what that black does is that black gives you a lot of depth. So I just have three values here: a black, a gray, and a white. but that's enough to start the illusion of a form. Now jumping back over to this dry brush square, I have white on the end of my brush now, not very much at all, and I'm just gonna go over that transition area, and as the little bit of residue that's left over on some of the bristles comes off, you'll start to get the illusion of some midtones. Now to do two spheres here, I'm just gonna trace a circle. And the first sphere I'm gonna do is a wet on wet. So think back to that wet on wet gradient. A little bit of a different approach here than mixing the extender right into the paint is putting it onto the paper. And you'll see how easy the paint moves across the surface when I do that. Now I'm just starting with the darkest areas, my core shadow and my occlusion shadow. I'm going to continue working with a limited value scale of white, gray, and black, the same way I was just doing with the mountains. Now I'll just add the gray to the halftones or the midtones, and then I'm also going to add gray to the reflected light area. Now notice I'm going to intentionally grab some of the black paint and bring it into the reflected light, and this is to ensure that I keep the shadow area darker than the light area. Now I added some white, and now it's just a process of blending and smoothing and going across these transitional areas and try to make sure that I'm avoiding any abrupt changes in values, because any of those are going to throw off the illusion. And as I'm continuing to work through this, I add more paint to the light area. I like to build up the paint in that light area, and having a little bit of a thicker application will help with the illusion of a three-dimensional form. And and opposite of that, I will try to keep my paint a little bit thinner in the shadow area or in the reflected light. Now, as I start adding a background here, I'm thinking about the edges. I'm thinking about, well, if I did mess up on my sphere and it's not exactly a perfect sphere, it's a little lumpy, I can try to use that to clean up the edges of my form a little bit. One little touch up right there. Notice the direction of my brush marks too, because if some of those marks do show through in the end, which something is going to, it's good that they are going the right direction. And then just a little bit of a touch up here in the reflected light to lighten that up and show the light that's bouncing off of the surface up to the bottom of the form. Now I'm gonna do the same thing, but just use some dry brush techniques. So I'm not using any of the flow extender or water or anything to increase the drying time of the paint or to increase the flow of the paint. I'm gonna start it pretty much the same way, breaking down the sphere into those primary values of light, medium, dark, put those in the correct areas, kind of block it in, you could say, and then I'm just gonna go back in a second pass, starting in that center light area with some light paint and working my way out in a radial pattern. And I think that this is a really good technique for people that are new to the medium. I think that it is a little bit easier to control. You're probably going to make fewer mistakes. It might not be as smooth, but I think it's just as convincing as an illusion. You can see here I'm going back in and continuing to kind of work in these passes through it, darkening certain areas, lightening certain areas, and that same idea that I was talking about previously of building up the paint in the light area, I'm doing again here, and just kind of blending it outwards. And that's pretty much it. I think that's a good introduction to some of the basic techniques, and I think that these are some good exercises to get started with. Good luck.